In literature, one can find a distinction between a peripheral and a central influence of religion in wars and violent conflicts. The Russian-Ukrainian conflict has manifested a more peripheral influence, which relates to the loyalties and identities of the players of the conflict, as opposed to a more central influence, which deals with political goals of the combatant parties. We see that all parties of the conflict, Russia, Russia's proxies in Donbas, so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and Ukraine use religion to promote its own political agenda. However, a closer examination reveals that the core goals of the conflict are primarily secular, which is for Russia and its proxies is keeping control over Ukraine and preventing the country from the drift towards the West and European institutions, while for Ukraine is securing its independence and its right to choose its own geopolitical vector. I don't mean to say that there is only rational logic behind the conflict, like economic logic, for example. Of course, it has much to do with historical memory, with the imagination of the Russian state and kind of Russian civilization. It has much to do with imperialism as a feature of the Russian political elite's mind and so on. But religion is just a part, and I would say not even the most important part of this picture. Of course, we see some religious justification behind the conflict. For example, President Putin justified the annexation of Crimea, in particular, referring to the fact that Crimea is a kind of sacred space for Russia and Russians, because Prince Vladimir, who baptized the Rus, was baptized in Crimea. It's a very controversial statement or point, because Vladimir is a part of the Russian history and a part of the Ukrainian history, but nevertheless, we see some religious rhetoric. Also, the Russian Orthodox Church has developed the doctrine called Russian world, Ruski Mir, as a sphere of political, cultural, spiritual influence of Russia, which includes Ukraine. However, an American historian of Ukrainian origin, Serhiy Plokhy, in his book, The Last Empire, it's a book about the last days of the Soviet Union, shows that the secession of Crimea was discussed by Russian politicians and officials in 1991, long before the doctrine of Russian world or this idea of the sacred role of Crimea was invented or was offered to the public. Elizaveta Kaufman, a German and Russian political scientist, analyzed Kontakte, the most popular Russian social media, in order to understand how ordinary Russians perceive and interpret this conflict. She concludes that within the popular sphere, the conflict lacks strong religious connotations. Russians mostly interpret the conflict as a secular one, where religious issues such as the grant of autocephaly to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine is just one more battlefield in this war between Russia and the West, or Russia and Ukraine. In Donbas, in territories affected by the war, we see several paramilitary groups, such as the Russian Orthodox Army fighting against the Ukrainian government. These groups had a clear religious identification, a clear subjective affiliation with the Russian Christian Orthodoxy. However, their secularly argued nationalism, including mythologies like Russians and Ukrainians as one people, or the Ukrainian government as a fascist regime threatening Russians in the region, these mythologies contributing to their willingness to commit violence no less than their religious identification. And again, we should be aware that this sort of religious identification goes beyond Christian orthodoxy, goes beyond symbol of faith or some traditional practices. It includes, I would say, the sacralization of the Russian state and Russianness as a part of their identity, kind of special role of Russia in this world. In this sense, from the anthropological perspective, we should probably talk about faith rather than religion, as Catherine Warner said in her interview for our blog, because it has much to do with, as I said, with their sacralization of some secular issues as a Russian statehood, rather than with Christian Orthodoxy. It's an interesting question because both Russia and its proxies in Donbas, so-called People's Republics, argue that they defend this Russian Orthodox Christian identity of the local population, which is, according to them, under a threat or an attack by the Ukrainian government. It's worth noting that Eastern Ukraine, including territories which are currently under the control of the separatist republics, has been always domineered by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, which is a part of the Russian Orthodox Church, the religion that those paramilitary groups came to fight for. Before the conflict began in 2014, there was no evidence of any threat to this domineering position of the church in the region. After the conflict began, the church has continued to enjoy the same status of the religion of majority, including being favored by local authorities, elites, and the population in general. However, in the context of the whole Ukraine, the conflict itself has had a clear negative impact on the interests of the Russian Orthodox Church in the country. For instance, social trust to the Moscow Patriarchate and its leaders has decreased significantly. About 500 communities of the Moscow Patriarchate decided to leave the church and join the newly established Orthodox Church of Ukraine. The Moscow Patriarchate's leader, Patriarch Kirill, has in essence become persona non grata in Ukraine. We can't imagine his pastoral visit to the country in the short-term or even middle-term perspective. Finally, the Ecumenical Patriarchate challenged the status of Ukraine as a canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church, providing the Orthodox Church of Ukraine with autocephaly, ecclesiastical independence. This means that Ruski Mir, or the Russian world, as a doctrine of political doctrine of spiritual unity with Russian, has lost its prominence in the country. It's totally marginalized. It's no way an option in the public opinion of Ukraine. This is one of the most tragic parts of this story. The conflict has had a significant impact on the situation with religious freedom, first of all in Donbas and in the Russia-annexed Crimea. The People's Republics have morphed into the territory with the most brutal violators of religious freedom in contemporary Europe and the post-Soviet area. A region which was one of the most religiously diverse in Ukraine became a territory where just one religious community is really welcome. Both Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics tried to imitate the Russian model of church-state relations, implying the existence of an official or an endorsed religion and significant restrictions on religious competition in favor of this official church, which is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Yet, the affiliation with the Moscow Patriarchate does not necessarily secure protection for a politically disloyal person. For example, politically disloyal priest, we know such cases. The Russian Orthodox identification plays in concert or even as a part of being loyal to the People's Republics. From this perspective, being Russian Orthodox means also being supportive to People's Republics, to the regimes in People's Republics and their independence from Ukraine, while a pro-Ukrainian political stance means that this person is not truly a Russian Orthodox Christian. There are also religious minorities which are severe pressure and persecutions committed by the People's Republic's authorities because they consider these religious minorities as alien or harmful for the local population, or because they think that they are disloyal for some reasons. This includes the Ukrainian churches, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and churches which are associated with both Ukraine and the West. For example, Protestant churches like Baptist communities, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Jehovah's Witnesses, in addition to some Eastern religions like Krishnas. However, unlike in Russia, where the legal system is stable and relatively effective, though Russian religious legislation is often unfair and violates standards of international human rights law, the DPR-LPR legal rules and procedures can be spontaneously replaced by purely arbitrary exercise of power and violence. This was the case especially in 2014-2015, when military groups operating in People's Republics can just confiscate several church buildings for bases and firing points, or they could seize church property for their needs and so on. So we know cases, for example, of murders and kidnappings of priests and believers. We know many cases of tortures of religious leaders and activists. For example, there was a case of Greek Catholic priest Tikhon Kulbaka, who was forced to suffer his own mock execution. We know many situations when religious minorities' property was confiscated. We know examples of discrimination against and stigmatization of religious minorities. There are several cases of manifestations inspired or directly organized by the People's Republic's authorities against religious minorities such as Greek Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists, labeled as sects, harmful cults for this region. We know cases of deportations and bans on entering the DPR, LPR, and acts of vandalism and humiliation against religious minorities. For example, one of Baptist priests, Vitaly Sorakun, told me about the case when militants entered a Baptist church and used Baptist property and used copies of Bible to keep a fire going and cooking the food. Crimea has transitioned from the relatively liberal regulation of religion in Ukraine to the intrusive authoritarian regulation of the Russian legal system. Religious pluralism has significantly decreased in the region after following the annexation of the peninsula. Several religious leaders, for example, some Protestant pastors, left or were deported from the peninsula. Restrictive and vague Russian legislation, especially Russian anti-extremist legislation, which provides the state with legal tools to prosecute effectively every religion in the country, have undermined the institutional freedom, the missionary work, any public activities of religious minorities, including their social services for the poor, for example. Again, it has less to do with religious motivations and more with political reasons and factors such as reliability of religious minorities and certain political motives and considerations. For example, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine under a heavy pressure, while the Greek Catholic Church under a less pressure because of its links with the Vatican, with which the Kremlin would like to maintain good relations. In general, the Crimea situation is similar to that of Russia, where the contemporary norm is securitization of religious issues, oppression of religious minorities, and endorsement of the Russian Orthodox Church as de facto official religion. Religious freedom in Russia is a separate and difficult topic. I just mentioned two examples. Two cases happened during the conflict. The first one is infamous Yarovaya Ozerov law, which put virtually any religious activity, including the private sharing of beliefs, under the state's control. And in 2017, the Russian Supreme Court completely banned the Jehovah's Witnesses organization in Russia as extremist. And I think it's the first case when a well-known religious minority was not just persecuted by the government, but was totally banned. The language of the Ukrainian Constitution is quite similar to the language of the First Amendment of the American Constitution. There are both the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause in Article 35 of the Ukrainian Constitution, as opposed to many European constitutions where there is only the Free Exercise Clause. However, since the independence in 1991, there has been a gradual reapproachment between the state and religion, which was intensified in 2014 when the conflict began. The main Ukrainian religions, with one obvious exception of the Moscow Patriarchate, have strongly supported the Ukrainian government in the conflict with Russia and promoted its vision of the conflict both inside the country and abroad, for example, in the European Union institutions and in the United States. Considering religion as a matter of national security, the Ukrainian government was deeply involved in the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and negotiated its autocephaly, ecclesiastical independence, with the ecumenical patriarchate. The government implemented several restrictions and limitations against the Moscow Patriarchate. For example, the Moscow Patriarchate is prohibited to send its chaplains to the Ukrainian army. The government also simplified the process of Moscow Patriarchate's communities transferring to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And finally, the government wants the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate to be renamed. Now the official name of the church is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, full stop. No Moscow Patriarchate is mentioned in its name. The government wants the church to be renamed in something like the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. This measure, however, which is quite controversial from the perspective of international law of human rights, has not been enforced yet. There are some other signs of a more cooperative model of church-state relations in Ukraine. For example, in 2015, the state granted religious organizations with the right to establish educational institutions like universities, schools, kindergartens, and so on. The government also recognized theologian schools' academic degrees as state-granted academic degrees with certain financial benefits for those who obtain those degrees. However, if we compare Ukraine with other post-Soviet Orthodox majority countries like Georgia and Moldova, and especially Belarus and Russia, we will conclude that Ukraine has not reached the level of closeness between the state and the church that has been developed in those countries. The relations between the state and the Orthodox Church are not so close because, first of all, because of the split within the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and because there are several churches in the country pretending to be a national or the national church of Ukraine. Also, there are several influential religious minorities with political representation on different levels of the government. And the Ukrainian religious legal framework is still quite liberal, probably one of the most liberal in the post-Soviet area, because Ukraine cannot ignore European standards of religious freedom as the state declares its wish and its goal to join the European Union.